Spark and Shadow. Prologue. The Crimson Whisper rode the dark like a blade, a slender red-eye vessel built for silence and the slow, patient hunger of its people. Its hull drank starlight and spat it back in thin, deliberate reflections as the ship threaded a corridor between drifting ice fields. The crew moved with the practiced economy of those who had learned to trust the ship more than one another. Hands that adjusted valves, eyes that read instruments, voices that were low and measured. Outside, the void was a black ocean. Inside, the ship was a heart that beat to the rhythm of a single, unspoken purpose. Then the storm found them. It arrived as a cold that was not merely temperature but intent, a lattice of crystalline wind that tore at sensors and sang through the hull like a chorus of knives. The Crimson Whisper shuddered as ice formed along its ribs, filigree spreading across observation ports until the stars were smeared into ghostly smudges. Instruments stuttered and died in a cascade of static. The ship's whisper became a groan. Men and women who had never known fear felt it then, a raw animal alarm that rose from bone and blood. "Report," Lyssandra's voice said through the comms, a thread of silk and steel that cut through the static. The Queen's presence was a command that did not need to be spoken. It was already in the ship's architecture, in the way the crew straightened, in the way the youngest of them swallowed and steadied his hands. "External systems failing," the helmsman said. His voice was small. "Ice lattice forming on forward arrays. We're losing telemetry. We can't break free without." "Without what?" Lysandra asked. Her tone was patient, but the patience had teeth. "Without thrust. Without a clear vector. We're being sheared off course." The words came like a confession. The comms crackled. For a moment the only sound was the storm's high keening and the ship's labored breath. Then a new voice, older and steadier, filled the channel. "We are cut off," the envoy said. "We cannot reach the Alliance relays. We cannot warn the fleet." Lyssandra's silence stretched. In that silence the crew felt the weight of centuries. The Red Eyes had always been architects of slow dominion. Their influence grown through patience and the careful cultivation of debts. They did not ask for favors. They did not beg. They made demands. "Then make the demand that cannot be ignored," Lysandra said at last. Her words were a blade wrapped in velvet. "Call the tournament of consorts. Call it now." The envoy's breath hitched. "The tournament? Yes." Lysandra's voice hardened. "Summon the queens. Let the galaxy see that the Red Eyes will not be cut off and left to freeze in the dark. Let them remember what it costs to ignore us." The Crimson Whisper trembled as if in agreement. Outside, the ice storm ground itself against the hull and then, as if repelled by the force of a will, began to abate. The crew worked with a new, frantic precision, fingers moving faster, voices sharper. The ship's systems came back in ragged increments. Telemetry returned like a tide. The envoy transmitted the order, a single, irrevocable signal that would ripple outward and not be forgotten. Lysandra closed the channel. The storm had been a threat and a message both. The universe could be indifferent, but the Red Eyes were not. They would make the galaxy answer. They would make the queens gather. They would make the tournament of consorts into a reckoning. When the Crimson Whisper limped away from the ice field, its hull scarred and its crew shaken, the order had already begun to spread. Across systems and through channels both legal and illicit, the summons traveled. A ceremonial contest, a brutal reassertion of power, a spectacle that would bind rivals and redraw alliances. The queens would come, the amphitheater would fill, and somewhere, beneath twin silver suns, the Hall of Harmonies would open its gates to a new chapter of hunger. Chapter 1. The Gathering of Galaxies. In the crystalline amphitheater of Gaian Prime, carved like a wound into cliffs that caught the light of twin silver suns and threw it back in 1,000 fractured promises, the galaxy's oldest rivalries gathered into a single, humming point of tension. Gaian Prime itself breathed. Its cliffs were living facets of stone and root, veins of mineral and sap pulsing faintly beneath translucent surfaces, and the Hall of Harmonies rose from that living rock like a cathedral built by patience and appetite. Here, where the air tasted of old blood and the sand beneath the arena floor had been stained red by centuries of ambition, the three queens stood as the axis of a fragile peace, each a sovereign of a domain that bent the cosmos to a different law. Queen Lysandra Bloodveil of the Red Eyes moved as if the shadows were her courtiers. Alabaster skin stretched over a frame that suggested both porcelain fragility and the tensile strength of bone, and her crimson gaze was a blade honed by calculation. Her presence cooled the air. Conversations hushed as if the room itself feared to breathe too loudly. Lysandra's power was the slow, inevitable kind. She commanded the hunger of night and the architecture of secrecy. She could unmake a man's memory as easily as she could unmake his pulse, weaving influence through whispers and bloodlines, turning loyalty into a lattice of debts and favors that spanned systems. Her domain was the interstice between life and unlife. The shadowed pleasure moons where the wealthy traded eternity for indulgence, the hidden veins of the black markets, the political back alleys of the Galactic Alliance where treaties were signed in ink and sealed in blood. She smiled rarely, and when she did, it was the smile of a predator who had just decided which limb to spare for later. Queen Calith Moonfang of the Furies was a different kind of inevitability, lupin lithe, and electric with a feral grace that made the crowd lean forward as if to catch the scent of her. Her silver hair was a wild mane, her eyes a pair of moons that reflected the hunger of pack and hunt. She wore the history of the wild on her skin, a map of scars and trophies. Calith's power was the law of the hunt and the communion of the pack. She could call storms of teeth and fang across a battlefield, bind the wills of savage warriors with a single howl, and turn the most civilized soldier into a thing that moved on instinct and devotion. Her domain was the borderlands and the war rings, asteroid belts where clans fought for ore, moons that served as gladiatorial preserves, and the hinterlands where civilization frayed into myth. She ruled by passion and by the terror of being consumed, and her followers loved her with a devotion that was as dangerous as it was absolute. Queen Thalera Stormspire of the Gaeans was the third pillar, a giantess whose height made the amphitheater's columns seem like saplings. Her presence was the slow thunder of tectonics, a regal, earthy fire that warmed and scorched in equal measure. Golden eyes like molten or watched the proceedings with a patience that had outlived empires. When she moved, the ground answered, and when she spoke, the cliffs themselves seemed to rearrange their echoes. Thalera's power was elemental and territorial. She could call the bones of a planet to shift, summon quakes that rearranged coastlines, and bend the mineral wealth of a world to her will. Her domain was the habitable worlds themselves. The green, breathing planets whose soils held the promise of life, the deep mines where the Gaeans coaxed ore from stone, and the colossal engineering works that only giants could conceive. In the arena she was serene and terrifying, a force that could be both cradle and cataclysm. For 8 centuries these three had bled the stars dry in a war that had erased monarchs and rewritten dynasties. Now, after the deaths of the old kings and the slow exhaustion of endless conquest, they had stitched a piece together with ritual and spectacle. The Tournament of Consorts was that stitch. A brutal, ceremonial contest where warriors from across the galaxy fought not merely for favor, but for the right to stand beside a queen and become a living symbol of alliance. Over 500 men had already fallen in the sand, slain by champions, by the queen's own hands, or by the merciless geometry of the games, and the amphitheater reeked of ambition, of blood, of the red sand that drank both. Hordes of onlookers packed the tiers, a living map of the Alliance's diversity, their cheers a tide that rose and fell with each dispatching of a contender. Humanity, the galaxy's newest entrant, had watched from the margins for years, sending observers and diplomats rather than champions, preferring survival to spectacle. But the ultimatum had been absolute. Present a champion or be cast out of the Alliance's councils forever. The Earth delegation, fragile and proud, could not afford exile. They could not afford to be judged cowards. So they sent one of their finest, a message wrapped in hope and a prayer. Corporal Glenn Calcine of House Calcine stepped into that cosmic theater like a single human heartbeat against the slow pulse of the queens. Decorated in campaigns across Earth and its colonies, a bioengineered electrokinetic prodigy raised by the last noble house of elementals after the biotech wars, Glenn carried in his body the legacy of human ingenuity and the desperate gamble of a humanity that had learned to weaponize its own body to remove the need for conventional weaponry. He was a lethal combatant, trained to turn lightning into a blade, but he was also a man who had never truly been seen by the galaxy. His record was local, his name unknown beyond a handful of systems. Watching the arena, Glenn felt the old, animal dread that comes before a storm. He was no diplomat, and he had not come to court favor with words. He watched as another man was torn down. Cheers, a flash of crimson, the crowd's appetite sated for the moment, and he could not wait for the ordeal to end. The seats around him emptied as if the amphitheater itself were making room for fate. 3 colossal Gaian guards, living stone and muscle, lumbered down the aisles toward him, their steps like distant avalanches. He had been sent under the guise of diplomacy, unaware that the ritual's teeth would close around him, that the tournament's rules were not merely spectacle but a reassertion of power. Present a champion, or be devoured by the politics of survival. As the queens watched, Lysandra with a smile that promised slow, exquisite endings. Caliph with a hunger that could turn a man into myth. Thalara with a patience that could crush mountains. Glenn Calcine stood at the center of a galaxy's gaze. A single human spark in an amphitheater built to test whether that spark could become a torch or be snuffed out to feed the old, hungry stars. Around him the crowd's roar became a physical thing, a pressure that pushed at his ribs. He felt the weight of his house's expectations, the quiet prayers of a species that had never before been asked to spill so much blood for recognition. He felt the training in his muscles, the cold calculus of tactics that had been hammered into him by instructors who had taught him to read currents of energy like maps. He felt, too, the small private fear that had nothing to do with honor or politics. The fear of being the first human to die in a spectacle meant to remind the galaxy of its hierarchies. The Gaian guards reached him, and their hands were like the grips of small mountains. They did not speak. Their faces were carved from the same patience that had raised the cliffs. They escorted him down into the arena where the sand drank light and the air tasted of iron. The floor was a mosaic of scars, each one a story of ambition and failure. The amphitheater's lights dimmed as the queens leaned forward, their attention a blade that cut through the noise. Chapter 2: The Arena of Ashes. The amphitheater exhaled as Glenn Calcine stepped into the center of the Arena of Ashes. Walls of living stone rose around him, draped in banners of blood and bone that snapped like the ribs of dead gods. Heat and dust curled from the sand. The air tasted of iron and old promises. He was smaller than the towering alien warriors who had carved reputations into the galaxy, but his presence was electric, literally. Sparks danced across his skin in a lattice of blue-white light. His eyes glowed with stormlight, and the hum of power pulsed in the air like a second heartbeat. The herald's voice cut through the din, ceremonial and absolute. The Earth Confederation has sent a single champion to face the chosen of the queens, or forfeit humanity's place among the stars. Glenn's answer was a soldier's calm. I do not fight for sport. I do not raise my hands unless it is to the death. If this is your way, then send all 3 champions against me at once. Silence fell like a held breath. Then the arena erupted. From the Red Eyes tunnel Lord Varric Shadowfang emerged first, a silhouette of midnight and menace. He moved with the practiced grace of a duelist, blades of black fire coiling in his hands like living shadows. Behind him, a cadre of red-eyed duelists sleek, pale and precise, fell into formation, their short blades glinting with ceremonial hunger. From the Fury's Gate came Ragnar Ironclaw, a hulking werewolf in spiked armor, his breath steaming in the arena light. He was flanked by a pack of Furies, lean, fang-toothed warriors who moved with the syncopated rhythm of a hunt. Their claws and hooked blades dripped with a slow, glistening venom that smoked where it struck. From the Gaian's ramp strode Titanus Stonebreaker, a mountain of a man whose hammer had been forged from collapsing stars. 2 Gaian shock wardens lumbered at his sides, shields dented from 1,000 sieges, faces set like the cliffs that birthed them. They charged as one, a storm of steel, fang and fury. The queen's banners snapped above them. The crowd's roar became a physical force. Glenn stood his ground, the current in his veins coiling like a spring. Lightning erupted from his body, arcs of electricity lashing across the arena in jagged, beautiful lines. He did not flinch. He did not shout. He moved with impossible speed, a blur of motion. Varric met him first. The vampire's blades were dark poetry, each stroke meant to unmake balance and leave a man bleeding into legend. Varric danced forward, blades whispering. Glenn answered with a storm. A filament of current braided itself into the air and snapped like a whip. The black fire met the lightning and screamed. Varric's blades flared, then disintegrated into ash as the current chewed through the dark flame's weave. The red eye staggered, eyes widening with a predator's surprise. Glenn closed the distance and drove a palm into Varric's chest, sending a concentrated bolt through bone and blood. The vampire convulsed, then crumbled into a fine, ashen wind the arena swallowed. But Varric's duelists surged. 6 moved as one, a ring of blades and intent. Glenn pivoted, a soldier's economy of motion. He planted his feet and sent a radial pulse through the sand. The grit became a conductor, and the current leapt up through the soles of their boots. Screams cut the air as muscles seized and blades clattered. He followed with a cascade of arcs that danced along tendon and joints. As knees buckled, wrists spasmed, the ring collapsed into a heap of stunned, smoking bodies. He dispatched them as he would clear a flank on a battlefield. Quick, clinical, without hesitation. Ragnar and his pack hit next, a living wave of teeth and claws. The Furies moved with the terrifying grace of predators who had practiced death as ritual. They tried to flank him, to drag him into the pack's maw. Glenn became motion itself. He blurred between strikes, a pivot here, a feint there, and the sand answered his choreography. He kicked up a spray of charged grit that stung like 1,000 needles. The pack's momentum broke. A Fury lunged with a hooked blade. Glenn caught the wrist and sent a shock that shattered bone with a sound like breaking glass. Another leapt for his throat. Glenn twisted, planted a foot, and channeled a pulse into the ground that bucked the attacker like a bronco. He used the pack's rhythm against them, turning coordinated leaps into collisions. Where they tried to bite and tear, he struck nerves and tendons, leaving snarling bodies twitching in the sand. Ragnar, larger and more brutal than his retinue, came at him with a roar that shook the banners. Glenn met the charge with a focused surge, catching the werewolf mid-strike and channeling voltage that shattered bone and ruptured sinew. Ragnar's howl cut off as he was hurled lifeless into the arena's dust. Titanus remained, a colossus whose hammer could have cleaved mountains. He swung with the slow, inevitable force of tectonics, each arc designed to end lives with a single clean motion. Glenn could not outmatch raw mass with speed alone. He had to be cunning. He baited the giant, drawing a swing that would have crushed a lesser man, and then at the last instant, drove his palms into the sand and sent a controlled surge through the arena's substrate. The ground shuddered, a localized quake that unbalanced the behemoth. While Titanus fought to regain footing, Glenn climbed the momentum, literally, leaping like a bolt of living lightning. He struck the giant's chest with a concentrated, focused discharge that punched through armor and flesh in a single thunderclap. The star-forged hammer slipped from Titanus's grasp as the giant's knees buckled and the great body collapsed, leaving a crater where a warrior had stood. Champions' retinues did not relent. Shock wardens and armored cohorts tried to rally, forming shields and spear walls to protect their fallen lords. A tech priest among the Gaian retinue threw up an anti-kinetic lattice, a shimmering field meant to dampen Glenn's arcs and turn his power into harmless static. For a heartbeat, the current in Glenn's veins felt like a caged animal. He tasted copper and the sharp tang of adrenaline. Then he remembered the battlefield lessons that had kept him alive. Electricity follows the path of least resistance, and resistance can be manipulated. He baited the priest into overreach, feigning retreat until the man lunged into a narrow corridor of sand. There Glenn struck the ground with both palms and sent a controlled surge through the arena's substrate. The anti-kinetic lattice flickered as the sand itself became a conductor. The current found the priest's dampening coils through the very ground the priest trusted. Sparks arced. The coils overloaded with a sound like a bell struck too hard. The field collapsed. The priest convulsed and slumped, his protective grid dying in a shower of sparks. Glenn moved like a commander clearing a flank. Prioritize the nodes of coordination, sever them, and let the rest collapse. He used the environment, charged sand, echoing walls, discarded metal, to amplify his strikes. He turned shields into conductors, spears into lightning rods, and enemy formations into traps for their own momentum. He did not gloat. He did not revel. He executed with the cold efficiency of a man forged in the crucible of war. At one point, a volley of hooked blades and thrown javelins came from 3 directions at once. Glenn read the arcs as if they were maps of wind. He stepped into the center, planted his feet, and spun, a living fulcrum. Currents braided around his limbs and flung the projectiles aside in a glittering halo. A spear that would have pierced a lung instead became a conduit that fed a chain of arcs into the ground, toppling a shield wall like a row of dominoes. By the time the sun dipped low and the amphitheater's lights took on a colder hue, the sand was a map of bodies and broken weapons. Champions lay where they had fallen, their retinues scattered and defeated. Glenn's breath came in ragged pulls. His uniform was scorched in places, his skin marked by the sting of arcs and the grit of sand. He had taken blows. Bruises would heal in minutes to come, but none had been fatal. He had moved through the chaos like a blade through cloth, cutting seams and leaving the fabric of the enemy's force in tatters. When the last subordinate crumpled, a stunned silence rippled outward from the ring. 3 champions lay dead. Their retinues were scattered and broken. Glenn stood in the center of the sand, chest heaving, sparks fading from his skin until he was only a man again. Scarred, breathing, and very much alive. He bowed his head, not in triumph but in a soldier's humility, and his voice carried across the stunned crowd. Humanity does not beg. Humanity does not break. We stand. The queens rose as one, a synchronized motion that sent a hush through the tiers. Lysandra inclined her head, a gesture almost like benediction. Calitha's lips parted in a sound that might have been a laugh or a growl. Thalara's voice rolled across the amphitheater like distant thunder. "You have survived the trial," she said. "You have shown cunning and endurance. The tournament is over, but the trials are not yet done." The crowd's roar returned, but it was different now. Less a tide of bloodlust, more a chorus of recognition. The queen's eyes were wide, not with disdain, but with something sharper, more dangerous, desire. For the first time, a man had matched their ferocity. For the first time, they felt something more than hunger. The arena of ashes held its breath, waiting to see what the spark of a single human might ignite. Chapter 3. The Queen's Desire. Glenn had thought the night would be a quiet thing. A wash of exhaustion, a few hours of sleep, and then the long ride back to Earth with a medal and a message. The Citadel of Celestials, where his quarters sat high above the amphitheater, was a place of carved light and patient stone. Its corridors hummed with the aftertaste of the day's violence, the echo of boots and the whisper of banners. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed and let the electricity in his veins cool, the stormlight in his eyes dimming to a steady ember. He was a soldier. He had done what soldiers did. He had survived. He did not expect company. The first to arrive was not announced by trumpets or fanfare. The door to his chamber opened with the soft, inevitable sound of something that had been expected all along. A shadow filled the threshold and then resolved into a shape that was both impossible and intimate. Thalara Stormspire, the giant queen, stepping into the room as if the ceiling had been built for her. Even seated, Glenn felt the room rearrange itself around her presence. Her golden eyes were like molten ore, patient and curious. And when she smiled, the stone of the citadel seemed to answer with a low, approving rumble. "You should not leave so soon," she said, voice a warm, rolling thunder that made the lamps flicker. "The world is not yet done with you." Glenn rose, instinctively small beside her. He had seen Thalara in the amphitheater, a force of tectonic calm, a queen who could make mountains listen. Up close she was less a colossus and more a careful thing. Her hands, when she extended one to him, were enormous but gentle, the pads of her fingers like warm boulders. "Your Majesty," he said, because that was what protocol demanded, and because the word felt like a rope thrown across a chasm. Thalara's laugh was a soft thing. "Titles are for treaties. Tell me instead, do you sleep well, little spark? Do you dream of storms or of home?" He told her the truth, that he dreamed of both, and of 1,000 small things that made him human. His mother's laugh, the smell of rain on Earth's soil, the way his hands remembered the feel of lightning. Thalara listened as if cataloging a rare specimen, and when she spoke again it was with a tenderness that surprised him. "You have the look of someone who has seen the edge and stepped back," she said. That is a dangerous kind of courage. It makes queens curious. She did not press him for more. Instead, she told him, in slow, careful sentences, about the Gaians' need for soil and stone, about worlds that had once fed their people and now lay scarred by ice. She spoke of minds that had gone silent, of engineers who could not coax or from dead veins, and of the way a giant's patience could turn to a hunger that was not easily sated. Her words were not accusation, they were a map of stakes. Glenn listened and felt the first, faint tug of the tournament's deeper purpose. This was not merely spectacle. It was a negotiation of survival. When Thalera left, she did so with a hand on his shoulder that left him steadier than he had been a moment before. The chamber seemed emptier when she was gone, as if the world had lost a heartbeat. She had not been gone long when the next queen arrived, and the air changed in a way that made Glenn's skin prickle. Caliph Moonfong came without ceremony, as if the night itself had decided to take a different shape. She filled the doorway with silver hair and a scent like wild rain. Her ample, bouncy frame swayed with her gown, and those milky, glowing eyes were bright and hungry, and when she smiled it was with the feral joy of a hunter who had found a rare prey. "You smell of storms and air," she said, easing into the room with a predator's grace. "You smell good." Glenn had seen Caliph in the arena. Her transformation had been a thing of raw, terrifying beauty, but here in the quiet of his quarters, she was less a beast and more a woman on the edge of a revelation. She moved closer, and for a moment he thought she would simply take him there in the doorway, that the night would end in a single, animal decision. In the blink of an eye she was on him, and Glenn could smell the animal smell of a freakish brute teeming with burning energy, with the thrill of longing and conquest. Caliph was fully transformed now, her silver fur pulling along the inside of her gown, and her chest heaved against his face, slowly suffocating him as she breathed lustfully into the top of his head, the smell like cinnamon and argan oil. Right before it seemed she would lose control, she swiftly licked Glenn's face, surprising him, and then lurched back, a look of pure terror in those frightful wolvish features. Instead she stopped, the wildness in her eyes giving way to something like shame, and she shrunk herself down to her normal, silver wolf woman form. "I am sorry," she said, voice low and rough. "I do not. This is not how I behave in council. But there is a hunger in me that is older than law. You are a spark, and I am a pack. I do not know how to be anything but honest. And it has been a very long time." She did not transform fully then. She let the suggestion of fur and fang ripple at the edges of her form, a promise rather than a consummation. She reached out and touched his cheek with a fingertip that was warm and patted on the palm side. Caliph fled into the night before he could speak, leaving behind the scent of wild things and the echo of a laugh that was half apology, half triumph. Glenn sat with the afterimage of her touch for a long time. He had expected desire from the queens. He had not expected the raw, unedited hunger of a creature who had been taught to take what she wanted. It unsettled him, but it also made him feel seen in a way the amphitheater's roar never had. He had barely had time to collect himself when the summons came that changed everything. A formal call to the throne room. His return flight was cancelled. A carriage, no, a platform, would take him to the Hall of Thrones. He dressed with hands that trembled not from fear but from the strange, electric anticipation of being the axis of three empires. The Hall of Thrones was a place of carved obsidian and living light, a room that had been grown rather than built. When he entered, the three queens were already there, arrayed like a constellation. Thalera at the left, her presence a slow, steady gravity. Caliph at the right, coiled and bright. And Lysandra Bloodveil in the center, a pale star whose light cut like a scalpel. Lysandra had been the last to arrive, and she had chosen to make an entrance that was both casual and devastating. She sat upon an obsidian seat that seemed to drink the room's warmth, her alabaster skin a contrast to the dark stone. Her crimson eyes were unblinking, and when she stared it was with a glare that made the courtiers stiffen. She had cancelled his flight with a single, clipped command. She had summoned him here because she wanted to see him under the light of her court. "Corporal Glenn Calcine," she said, voice like silk over steel. "You have made quite a mess of our expectations." Glenn bowed because he had been taught to bow, but he kept his chin up. I did what I was sent to do, Your Majesty. Lysandra stared at him a moment awkwardly once she heard his voice for the first time. A small yip escaped her mouth before she gathered herself, the other queens staring in puzzlement at her before she realized what she was actually feeling. The vampire queen's laugh was a sound he had not expected to hear from a queen who had been carved from winter. It was bright and sharp and for a moment, entirely human. You are amusing, she said. You are unexpected. Her advisors clustered around her like moths to a flame. Pale, precise figures in dark robes who had spent centuries learning the calculus of power. They were not amused. They were desperate. One of them, a thin man with eyes like polished coal, stepped forward and spoke in a voice that trembled with a mixture of fear and hopeful calculation. Your Majesty, he said, this human is a variable. He could be a consort, Lysandra interrupted, and the word fell from her lips like a verdict. Or he could be a spark that burns the wrong things. That is the point. Another advisor, a woman whose hair was braided with silver thread, pressed her hands together. If he chooses another, if he chooses Caliph or Thalara, our influence will be diminished. The Red Eye's expansion plans. Lysandra's eyes flicked to the woman, and for a heartbeat the room felt colder. Expansion plans, she repeated, tasting the phrase. Plans are fragile things. They break when the weather changes. There was an undertone in the room then, a current that ran beneath the formalities. The memory of the Crimson Whisper and the ice storm that had cut the Red Eyes off from their relays. The whispered reports of mining shafts choked with frost and sabotage on fury-held moons. The stalled fleets that could not push into uncharted corridors because of something that had shifted in the dark between stars. No one spoke the words aloud, but the hint of them made the advisors' faces taut. The tournament had been called in part to reassert control, to bind alliances with a spectacle that would distract and consolidate. But there was more. Something that had been set in motion by the storm, by a spurned consort whose revenge had rippled into the veins of commerce and conquest. The queens felt it like a bruise. Lysandra watched Glenn with an expression that was at once amused and calculating. You are dangerous, she said, stepping down from her throne and closing the distance between them with a grace that belied her regal stillness. Her hand found his cheek, cool and firm. You smell of lightning and of home. You are not like the others. Glenn felt the world narrow to the point of her touch. He had expected hunger, or acclaim, or the cold calculus of a queen who had seen centuries. Instead he found something like curiosity, and beneath it a vulnerability that surprised him. A queen who had not laughed in centuries, who had not let herself be amused, who now found him, of all things, humorous. You find me amusing? He asked, because the absurdity of the moment demanded a reply. Lysandra's smile widened, and for the first time since he had met her he saw the woman behind the crown. Yes, she said. You are a bright, combustible thing. I have not had a laugh in a long time. Do not waste it. Her advisors bristled. One of them, an older man with a voice like dry paper, stepped forward and, in a move that would have been scandalous in any other court, grabbed Glenn's sleeve and pulled him closer. Do not make a mockery of this, Corporal, he hissed. Do not choose poorly. Her Majesty, he choked on the title, then spat it out in a rush, was almost tolerable. Do not mess this up. The words landed like a slap and then, impossibly, the room broke into a ripple of suppressed laughter. The thin man's face had gone beet red. He had meant to be stern, to convey the gravity of dynastic politics, but his phrasing had been so clumsy that it had become comic. Caliph barked a laugh that was half growl. Thalara's chuckle was a low, amused rumble, and even Lysandra's lips twitched in a way that made the advisor's desperation look suddenly human. Glenn stared at the man, then at Lysandra, then at the three queens arrayed like a constellation. Your advisors have a way with words, he said dryly. The thin man's face crumpled into mortification. I meant, Your Majesty, the Red Eye's plans. Lysandra waved him away with a languid hand. Let them speak, she said. They are frightened. They will say anything to keep their comforts. The court settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. The queens spoke in turns, each revealing a sliver of their desire and their fear. Thalara spoke of worlds that needed steadiness. of the Gaeans' fear that the mines would never sing again if the wrong alliances were made. Caliph spoke of borders that had become lawless, of fury clans who needed a leader who could bind them with both ferocity and tenderness. Lysandra spoke of networks, of debts and favors, and the way a single consort could be a node that rewired loyalties across systems. When it was Glenn's turn to speak, he found his voice steadier than he felt. He told them that he had no desire for crowns or palaces, that he had been raised to fight and to protect, and that his loyalty was to the people who had made him. He did not say that he had been bioengineered, that his blood carried the legacy of House Calcine. He let the queens discover that in their own time. He did not beg. He did not posture. He answered with the blunt honesty of a man who had been forged in conflict. Lysandra listened as if tasting a new wine. When he finished, she stepped closer, so close that he could see the tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in her fingers. "You are not a prize to be won," she said softly. "You are a choice. More dangerous." Calitha's eyes flashed. "Dangerous is good," she said. "Dangerous makes the pack stronger." Thalara's hand rested on the stone beside her, and the room seemed to breathe with the slow patience of a world. "Dangerous is honest," she said. "We have all been dangerous in our time. We have all been wrong." The court murmured. The advisors exchanged glances that were equal parts calculation and fear. The thin man who had earlier implored Glenn not to mess this up hovered at the edge of the room, his jaw clenched. He had not meant to be comic. He had meant to be desperate. The desperation in the room was real. The ice storm had been a wound, and the tournament was a salve that might also be a blade. When the formalities ended, Lysandra did something that no queen had done in living memory. She asked Glenn to walk with her. They left the Hall of Thrones and moved through corridors that smelled of old incense and newer politics. The Citadel's night was a different thing when it was just the two of them. Quieter, less performative, the echoes of the court falling away until only the sound of their footsteps remained. They walked in silence for a long time. Then Lysandra spoke, not as a queen but as a woman who had been alive for centuries and had learned the cost of letting anyone close. "You are not like the others," she said. "You do not wear your courage as armor. You wear it like a wound, like a broken part of you. I am attracted to the broken parts of men. It guides me to their souls without words. The other queens sense this too, but what do you think of yourself?" Glenn did not know how to answer that. He had been taught to hide pain, to make it useful. "I am what I was made to be," he said finally. "I fight. I survive. You are more than that," Lysandra interrupted. "You are a thing that can be trusted and betrayed in the same breath. That terrifies me." She stopped and turned to him, and for the first time he saw the centuries in her face. The small lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her smile did not always reach them. "I have been patient for a long time," she said. "Patience is not the same as indifference. I have learned to keep my heart like a locked room." Glenn felt something in his chest loosen. "Why tell me this?" "Because you are the first to make me laugh in a very long time," she said, and the admission was so small and so human that it made him want to laugh too. "Because you are the first to make me consider the possibility of letting you into my locked room." He wanted to ask her what she feared most, what the ice storm had taken from her, what the spurned consort had done to the Red Eye's plans. He wanted to know whether she would use him as a node in a network or as a partner in something that might be more fragile and more honest. But he did not ask. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, a small, reckless thing, and felt the coolness of her skin, the tremor that still lived in her fingers. Lysandra did not pull away. She let him hold her hand, and in that small contact there was a promise that was not yet named. Of trust, of vulnerability, of a queen who might be willing to risk more than she had in centuries. They returned to the Hall of Thrones before dawn. The court had dispersed, the advisors retreating to their calculations and their fears. Caliph had gone to the hunting grounds, and Thalara had returned to the mines to listen to the earth. Glenn stood in the center of the hall, and felt the weight of the choice settle on him like a cloak. He could choose Thalara, whose steadiness promised worlds and the slow, certain work of rebuilding. He could choose Caliph, whose passion would bind him to a pack that would fight with a ferocity that could remake borders. Or he could choose Lysandra, whose laughter had cracked centuries of winter, and whose touch had shown him a vulnerability that was both terrifying and intoxicating. He thought of Earth, of rain on soil, of the people who had raised him, of the fragile, stubborn hope that had sent him here. He thought of the Crimson Whisper, and the ice storm that had been the spark for this spectacle, of the spurned consort whose revenge had rippled into the veins of commerce and conquest. He thought of the Queen's needs and fears, and of the way the tournament had become a stage for something larger than spectacle. When the first light of dawn crept through the hall's high windows, Glenn made his choice. He did not make it with fanfare. He did not make it with a speech. He walked to Lysandra and took her hand again, this time with the deliberate steadiness of a man who had been forged in storms. "I choose you," he said. Lysandra's crimson eyes widened, and for a moment the centuries seemed to tilt. The court's advisors whooped and then fell silent, their faces a map of relief and calculation. Kalitha's howl echoed faintly from the hunting grounds, an animal sound that was not wholly displeased. Thalara's hand rested on the stone, and the earth hummed in a way that felt like approval. Lysandra's laugh broke free then, bright and disbelieving and utterly human. She drew him close and kissed him, not with the hunger of a predator but with the careful, fierce tenderness of someone who had decided to risk a heart. Around them the Hall of Thrones held its breath, and somewhere beyond the citadel the stars shifted as if to take note. The choice did not end the politics. It did not erase the ice storm or the stalled mines or the stalled fleet, but it changed the axis of the negotiation. Where there had been 3 queens circling a spark, there was now a queen and a consort who had chosen one another. The tournament had been a spectacle. The choice was a treaty written in a language older than law. As dawn broke fully and the citadel filled with the slow, inevitable bustle of a world waking, Glenn felt the weight of what he had done. He had not only chosen a queen, he had stepped into a web of obligations and dangers that would test him in ways the arena never had. Lysandra's hand in his was warm and steady. Her advisors whispered and recalculated. But for the first time since the Crimson Whisper had limped away from the ice, there was a small, stubborn light that felt like a promise. Lysandra's laughter echoed in his ears, and he realized that whatever came next, war, negotiation, sabotage, or love, he would not face it alone. Chapter 4. The Frost at the Gates. Glenn woke to the sound of someone clearing their throat with the exaggerated patience of a man who had watched empires tremble, and still found time to scold. A humming extended from the far side of the wall, so of Glenn's quarters, something that had lulled him back to sleep nearly 2 hours ago, and was doing so again now. The morning light through the citadel's high windows was thin and pale, as if the day itself were still rubbing sleep from its eyes. He blinked, reached for the edge of the bed, and found a hand, small, precise, and annoyingly familiar, already on his sleeve. Up, the advisor said, voice a brittle thread of officiousness. He was the same thin man who had implored Glenn not to mess this up. And he had not improved with sleep. "What are you doing in here, man? What happened to the alarm?" asked Glenn. "You have been ignoring the alarm," said the vampire advisor, pointing at the corner of the room, and the glowing hum of the wall by the door. Glenn looked up at the old vampire, who almost flicked a bit of amusement through their sudden gaze. "You are late for your duties as consort in waiting. There are protocols. There are gifts to accept." "There are," he faltered, then added with a flush, "mothers to placate." Glenn sat up and rubbed his eyes. "Mothers?" The advisor's face went through a series of expressions that might have been calculation, might have been envy, might have been the dawning horror of someone who had to explain interspecies etiquette to a human. "Your mother, of course. How's Calcine? She will want assurances. She will want to know that you are not being—" He searched for the right word and failed spectacularly. "Consumed." Glenn snorted. "Consumed? Il chose Lysandra. She's not exactly a casserole." The advisor blinked, then, in a move that would have been comic if the stakes were not dynastic, he clapped a hand to his mouth and pretended to cough. "Do not joke about the Queen's culinary habits," he hissed. "It is unseemly." Glenn laughed, the sound bright and human in the quiet chamber. The thin man's face, for all its officiousness, softened. "You are fortunate," he said, almost conspiratorially. "Her Majesty finds you amusing. She has not executed a noble for insolence in days. That is rare." Do not squander it. Noted, Glenn said, and the advisor retreated with the dignity of someone who had delivered a sermon and expected to be thanked for it. Outside the citadel, the city was waking. Messengers scurried like ants. Banners were adjusted, and the Hall of Thrones hummed with the low, nervous energy of a court that had been rearranged by a single human decision. Glenn dressed in the uniform that had become both armor and symbol. The faded blue of Earth's confederation, patched and scarred, but pressed and clean. He left his quarters with a grin that felt like a small rebellion. He ran into his commanding officer in the corridor, a broad-shouldered woman named Captain Maravas who had the kind of voice that could both order a retreat and tell a joke and make both sound like strategy. She looked him up and down with the frank appraisal of someone who had watched him grow from a recruit into a weapon. "Well, look at you," she said, hands on hips. "You did the thing. You put Earth on the map and didn't get yourself killed. That's a win." Glenn grinned. "I tried to keep the dying to a minimum." Mara's smile was a flash of warmth. "You did more than that. You made them listen. You made them laugh. You made a queen laugh, which is," she broke off, shaking her head in mock horror, "a diplomatic coup and a personal hazard." Glenn's grin widened. "My mother will be thrilled." Mara's expression shifted into something deliciously wicked. "Oh, your mother will have words. She will call you a traitor to House Calcine, a disgrace, and then she will try to melt Lysandra with magma to see if she bleeds like a proper consort." Glenn blinked. "She came too." Mara laughed. "She can and she will. Your mother is a force of nature, Glenn. She will be offended, then curious, then grudgingly impressed. That's the Calcine arc." Glenn's laughter died into a softer sound. "She'll be angry. She'll be loud," Mara said. "But she loves you. That's the part you can bank on. And if Lysandra can handle magma, she can handle your mother. If not, well," Mara shrugged, "we'll have a diplomatic incident and a very interesting funeral." Glenn shook his head, smiling despite himself. "Thanks, Captain. For everything." Mara's face grew serious for a beat. "You did good, Calcine. Remember that. And remember, don't let the politics make you forget who you are. If you need me, you know where to find me. Now go be a consort or a lightning god or whatever it is you're doing." He left her with a salute and a laugh, and the Citadel's corridors swallowed him toward the Hall of Thrones where Lysandra waited. The morning felt like a held breath. Outside, the sky was a pale sheet of promise. Inside, the court was a web of whispers. They had not been given long to savor the fragile peace. The first alarm came as a tremor underfoot, a shiver that ran through the stone like a warning. At first people thought it was an aftershock from the week's earlier events, a reminder of the amphitheater's violence. Then the air changed, a cold that was not weather but intent, a crystalline edge that bit at the skin and made the candles gutter. "Frost," someone whispered. The word moved through the hall like a contagion. The doors of the citadel burst inward with a sound like breaking ice. Figures poured through the breach, tall, terrible shapes that had been whispered about in old songs and used as threats to frighten children into obedience. Frost giants, their skin like blue-white marble, their breath a fog of shards, strode into the hall with the slow, inexorable grace of glaciers. At their feet ran packs of ice wolves, their fur like blown glass, teeth glittering. From the shadows swung great apes, fur rimed with frost, their hands like clubs and their eyes bright with a cunning that was not merely animal. And behind them, a figure moved with a fury that made the air itself recoil. Ymir, the spurned consort. He was a man carved from winter and rage, a warrior whose victories had been many and whose mercy had been few. He had bested champions in the tournament. He had proven his strength, but he had failed the trial that mattered. He had not understood that a consort must be more than a conqueror. He had not understood women who ruled in their own right. He had not understood that power could be shared without being stolen. That ignorance had become his undoing. Ymir's eyes found Glenn with a predator's focus. "You," he said, voice like grinding ice. "You took what was mine." Glenn stepped forward, the hum of his power a low, steady drum. "You were not chosen," he said. "You failed the trial." Ymir laughed, a sound like cracking glaciers. "I bested your champions. I broke their bones. I will break you. The frost giants moved like tectonic plates, their clubs smashing pillars and sending showers of stone. The ice wolves leapt with a speed that belied their size, and the apes swung through the hall, tearing banners and scattering courtiers like leaves. The citadel, for all its carved patience, was not built for this kind of war. Thalara rose first, her voice a low thunder that rolled through the hall. She stepped between the giants and the throne, her presence a living bulwark. "You will not take our halls," she said. Her hands glowed with the slow heat of the earth. She called the stone to answer her, and the floor rose in ridges that slowed the giants' advance. Caliph was a blur of silver and fong, a hunting storm that tore into the wolves and apes with a ferocity that made the beasts hesitate. She moved like a pack incarnate, binding and breaking, her claws finding throats and joints with a precision that was terrifying to behold. For a moment it seemed the queens would hold. Ymir laughed and stepped forward, and the hall seemed to freeze around him. He moved with a speed that belied his size, and when he struck Thalara she staggered, surprised, perhaps by the raw, brutal force he wielded. He fought her with a cold, efficient cruelty, and for a breath the giant queen was on the defensive. The court watched in a stunned silence as Ymir's blows drove Thalara back, as if the earth itself had been shoved aside. Glenn could have been proud of the queen's defense. He could have watched and learned and waited for the moment to strike. Instead he moved. He had been forged in skirmishes where hesitation meant death. He stepped into the fray with the same economy of motion that had won him the arena of ashes. Lightning braided around his fists. He became a spear of living storm. Ymir turned and met him, and the hall filled with the sound of two forces colliding. The spurned consort's blows were like avalanches, immense, crushing, designed to end things quickly. Glenn answered with arcs and feints, with the soldier's calculus of target and timing. He struck at joints, at the places where armor met flesh, at the seams of Ymir's confidence. Ymir's power was vast, but it was blunt. Glenn's was precise. They traded blows that rang like bells. Ymir's fist met Glenn's shoulder and sent a shock through his bones. Glenn's counterstrike found the soft spot beneath ribs and sent a flare of pain that made Ymir stagger. The frost giants surged, the wolves leapt, the apes roared, and the queens fought to hold the line. For a moment it seemed the citadel would be torn apart. Then Ymir did something that changed the shape of the battle. He turned his cold, cruel magic on Lysandra and Caliph. With a sweep of his hand he sent a lattice of frost that wrapped around them like a net. Lysandra's eyes cut off as ice crept up her limbs. Caliph snarled as fur and flesh were bound in crystalline chains. The queens were frozen in place, their faces set in shock and fury. "Finish him," Ymir snarled, and the giants surged forward, ready to crush the human who had taken what he believed was his. Glenn felt the world narrow to a single point. He could not let Ymir's cruelty stand. He could not let the queens be trophies of a man who had never learned to respect power that was not his to take. He moved with the speed of a man who had been trained to make every second count. He struck Ymir's knee with a concentrated bolt that buckled the leg, then drove a current up his spine that made him howl. Ymir swung and Glenn ducked, and then he found the seam in the man's armor and drove a surge into it that seared muscle and shattered bone. Ymir fell, a great, terrible thud. He was not finished. He rose, eyes blazing with the cold fire of a man who had been humiliated, and lunged for Lysandra with a final, desperate fury. He would not accept defeat. Lysandra, bound in ice, looked small and fragile for a heartbeat. Then something in her shifted. The ice that held her was not merely cold. It was a lattice of arrogance, a spell meant to humiliate. Her crimson eyes flared with a light that was older than the citadel. She drew on something that had been kept in the dark rooms of her court. A dark, patient magic that had been honed in centuries of silence. The ice cracked. She moved with a speed that belied her regal stillness. The chains shattered like glass. She rose, not as a victim but as a force. Ymir lunged, and she met him with a motion that was both precise and terrible. Her hand found his throat, and the dark magic she wielded was not merely destructive. It was a judgment. It unmade the arrogance that had animated him. Ymir's eyes widened as the life left him, and he fell back, a broken thing. Glenn stood over him, chest heaving, the stormlight in his eyes dimming to a steady sizzle. Lysandra's hand rested on his arm, cool and steady. She had freed herself and struck the killing blow. Not out of mercy but out of necessity. The court watched in a silence that was almost reverent. The frost giants, the wolves, the apes. Without Ymir's command they faltered. Thalara's voice rolled through the hall, calling the stone to bind the breach. Kalitha's pack scattered the remaining beasts. The citadel's doors were sealed. The battle was over. In the aftermath, the Hall of Thrones smelled of smoke and iron, and something like relief. Courtiers moved like ghosts, tending to the wounded, counting losses, recalculating alliances. The queens stood together, bruised but unbowed. Lysandra's crimson eyes were dark with something that might have been sorrow, or might have been the cold calculus of a ruler who had just killed a man in her hall. Glenn found himself surrounded by the Earth delegation. Diplomats with faces like maps, men and women who had come to watch and now had to explain what had happened to a planet that had sent a son into the teeth of galactic politics. His mother arrived with the force of a small volcano, magma-scented and incandescent, her presence a shock of heat in the cold hall. She looked at Lysandra with a mixture of suspicion and appraisal, and then at Glenn with a fierceness that made him want to laugh and cry at once. "You chose a bloodsucker," she said, voice like a rolling tide of molten rock. "You chose a woman who drinks the living. You have dishonored House Calcine." Glenn's mother was not subtle. She had the blunt, volcanic honesty of someone who had been forged in fire. Lysandra's expression did not change. She inclined her head with a courtesy that was both ancient and precise. "Lady Calcine," Lysandra said, voice like silk and steel, "I drink what I must to survive. I do not drink to dishonor." "Your son chose me." Glenn's mother's eyes narrowed. For a heartbeat the hall held its breath. Then something shifted in her face. Not acceptance, not yet, but a recognition of the man her son had become. She stepped forward and took Glenn's hand in both of hers, soft, warm, and fierce. "You are my son," she said simply. "If you are happy, I will try. But do not think I will be gentle." Lysandra's smile was small and almost private. "I would not ask for gentleness," she said. "I would ask only for honesty." There was tension in the room, old loyalties and new bonds braided together, but there was also a restraint that felt like respect. The Earth delegation spoke in measured tones, offering condolences for the wounded and praise for the bravery that had saved the Citadel. They asked questions about the ice storm, about Ymir's motives, about the stability of the region. The queens answered with the careful diplomacy of rulers who had just survived an attempt on their power. Glenn stood between his mother and his queen, feeling the weight of both. He had chosen a path that would not be easy. He had chosen a woman who had killed to protect her throne, and who had laughed at him in a way that made him feel both small and seen. He had chosen a life that would be full of danger and politics and strange, beautiful moments. His mother squeezed his hand. "Do not make me regret this," she said, half threat, half blessing. Glenn laughed, a sound that was raw and honest. "I won't," he said. "I'll try not to." Lady Calcine left with her armed guard to join the Earth delegation. Lysandra's hand found his again, cool and sure. Around them the court recalculated, the Earth delegation took notes, and the Citadel began to stitch itself back together. The frost at the gates had been driven back, but its shadow lingered in the maps and in the whispered reports of sabotage and stalled fleets. The tournament had been a spectacle, a negotiation, and a battlefield. It had also become a crucible in which a human had been forged into something more than a symbol. As the sun set and the Citadel's lamps burned low, Glenn stood with Lysandra and his mother and felt that the future might be terrible and beautiful in equal measure. He had chosen a queen, and in doing so he had chosen a life that would test him in ways the arena never had. The world would demand sacrifices. The stars would not be kind, but he had a queen who had laughed at him, who had freed herself and struck down a tyrant, and a mother he was hoping would not cause an incident. Chapter 5 of Mothers, Bites, and Howling Coos. Glenn had expected awkwardness. He had not expected a slideshow. He did not feel like getting burned by his mother and his fiancé today. Lady Calcine arrived at Lysandra's private salon like a small molten storm. Magma-scented, blunt, and impossibly direct. Lysandra received her with the courtliest of bows and the faintest of smiles, which only made Lady Calcine bristle in the most affectionate way possible. You are the vampire, Lady Calcine announced, as if introducing a particularly interesting spice. You drink. You laugh at my son. You have terrible taste in men. Lysandra's smile widened. And you are the woman who melts mountains and burns meals, she replied. I have heard rumors. Rumors are polite, Lady Calcine said. She sat, folded her hands, and produced a small battered hollow from beneath her cloak. Now then, before we speak of treaties and bloodlines, you must see this. Lysandra's eyebrow arched. Glenn's stomach did a small traitorous flip. The hollow flickered to life and the salon filled with a parade of Glenn's past. A teenage Glenn with a helmet too big for his head. A younger Glenn covered in mud after a training exercise. Glenn asleep in a bunk with a half-eaten ration bar stuck to his cheek. The final image was the worst. Glenn at a family festival mid-dance, arms flailing. Face a portrait of absolute joy. Lysandra's laugh, soft, surprised, bubbled out. Lady Calcine watched the queen's reaction like a general reading the weather. See, she said triumphantly. He is human. He is ridiculous. He is my baby. I want you to know what I am giving up. I want you to understand. Lysandra leaned forward, eyes bright. He is delightful, she admitted. You have raised a combustible thing. They traded stories. Lady Calcine produced more images. Glenn as a child trying to coax a sparking toy back to life. Glenn with a bandaged hand after a reckless experiment. Glenn asleep with a dog-eared book on his chest. Lysandra countered with small, carefully curated anecdotes about court life that made Lady Calcine snort with laughter. The two women, so different in origin and temperament, found a rhythm. Mockery, appraisal, then a grudging warmth. At one point Lady Calcine wagged a finger at Glenn. You will honor this woman as your queen. It's going to be impossible to explain this to the rest of the council, she said, half threat, half blessing. Lysandra's smile turned private. He will be well taken care of, she said. And if at any time you feel he is not, you can visit and see for yourself, Lady Calcine. Glenn, mortified and oddly proud, nodded intelligently. The promise was sincere and ridiculous in equal measure, and the three of them laughed until the salon's lamps dimmed, though Glenn didn't know how many more of these he could stomach a week. Later that night, after the court had dispersed and the citadel's corridors had quieted into the soft susurrus of guards and distant engines, Lysandra led Glenn through a private door into a garden grown beneath the citadel's glass. Moonlight pooled on obsidian paths. The air smelled faintly of iron and jasmine. It was a place made for secrets. They sat on a low bench. Lysandra's hand found his, cool and sure. You asked me once why I laughed, she said. Tonight I will tell you why I bite. Glenn swallowed. You told me you were dangerous. I am, she agreed. But danger is not the same as cruelty. There are things you should know. She spoke with the careful cadence of someone teaching a dangerous lesson. My senses are older than your instruments. I can read the cadence of a heartbeat across a crowded room. I can taste the lie in a diplomat's breath. I can feel the slow erosion of a treaty in the way a hand trembles. Glenn listened, fascinated. He told her in return about the modifications in his blood, the engineered channels that let him shape current, the grafted tissues that resisted overload, the training that taught him to treat his body like a circuit. Lysandra had already guessed much of it. She had smelled the metallic tang of engineered blood and seen the stormlight in his eyes. Still, hearing him explain the mechanics, how a neuron could be coaxed to carry a storm, how a scar could be a conduit, made her eyes gleam. You are a machine and a man, she said softly. That is a dangerous combination. They traded small experiments. Lysandra taught him how to read the subtle shifts in a room. The way a shadow lengthened when someone lied. The way a pulse stuttered when fear arrived. Glenn showed her how to feel the hum of a circuit, how to coax a filament of light to dance between fingertips. They laughed when a stray arc singed a rose petal. They cursed when a test left both of them smelling faintly of burned hair. Then the conversation slid, as conversations do, into the private and the ridiculous. Lysandra, with a candor that startled him, confessed that she had found him not only amusing but attractive. I have not wanted to be close to anyone in a very long time, she said. You make me want small, foolish things. I want to laugh more. I want to be less careful. I buried those feelings a long time ago. Glenn's heart thudded. You want to bite me, he said, half question, half joke. She looked at him, eyes bright with a mixture of mischief and something like fear. Yes, she said. I want to taste the spark. I want to know if your blood sings like your eyes. He considered the absurdity and the intimacy of the request. It was not a demand, it was a confession. He could have recoiled. Instead, he reached for her hand and squeezed. If it matters, he said, I trust you. Lysandra's smile was a small, astonished thing. She leaned forward and, with a gentleness that contradicted her reputation, pressed her lips to his neck and took a single, careful bite. It was not the savage thing the songs promised. It was a small, hot pressure, a quick taste. Glenn felt a warmth bloom where her teeth had touched, and then a coolness as she drew back. She tasted him, eyes closing. A surge of lightning rippled along her lips as the blood pulled down her throat. You are salt and storm, she murmured. You are liquid energy. He felt oddly honored and oddly terrified. The bite left a faint, crescent-shaped mark that would fade soon. It also left a new intimacy between them, a private ledger of trust. They spent the rest of the night talking and testing and laughing. He taught her how to feel the hum of a capacitor. She taught him how to read the lie in a smile. They fell asleep in the garden with their hands entwined. Two unlikely things that had found a fragile, fierce accord. Morning brought business and inevitably the thin man. The old advisor found Glenn in the Hall of Thrones, polishing a ceremonial blade with the kind of concentration usually reserved for prayer. He approached with the solemnity of a man who had just discovered a new protocol. Your Majesty, he began, then stopped, eyes flicking to Lysandra, who flushed away out to a veil at the far end of the hall and back to Glenn. Consort. There is a matter of etiquette. You must not. He gestured vaguely, at Glenn's neck, and then his own fangs. Then, in a fit of inspiration, produced a small, embroidered handkerchief and offered it to Glenn as if that solved centuries of interspecies awkwardness. Glenn took it, grinned, dabbed the bit of blood at his neck, and tucked it into his pocket. Thank you, he said. I appreciate it. The advisor blinked, then, to his credit, managed a small, horrified smile. Do not be flippant, he warned. There are protocols. Noted, Glenn said, and the advisor retreated, muttering about the decline of manners. Captain Mara found him afterward, arms folded and a grin that said she had been waiting for this. You and the Queen sleep well? She asked. We did, Glenn admitted. He realized now that everyone knew what was going on and just took it in stride. Good, she said. Because I have a report and a favor. The report is that Earth's standing has improved by approximately 1 laugh and 1 decisive victory. Military applications and navigation initiatives are being shared system-wide. Our people have even tried interspecies colonies on the outer fringes of our territory, something never even suggested before. What you've done here has been huge. The favor is that you will not let the court make you into a curiosity. Also, she leaned in conspiratorially. If Kalitha's faction tries anything, call me. When their mining operations came back online, there was a huge insurrection at their largest 2 Fury colonies. There have been skirmishes as recent as yesterday. They had not finished speaking when the coup began. An alpha from Kalitha's outer packs, young, ambitious, and very loud, burst into the throne room with the swagger of someone who had read too many victory poems. He challenged Glenn with a howl that echoed off the obsidian. You are a human, he snarled. You are not of our law. Fight me and prove your worth. Glenn sighed, the sound of a man who had been through worse paperwork. He stepped forward, the hum in his veins waking like a cat. The alpha leapt, teeth bared, dramatic and furious. Glenn moved with the same economy that had felled giants. He sidestepped, planted his feet, and sent a filament of current that tickled the alpha's flank. The wolf yelped, hair standing on end. And then, because the universe has a sense of humor, the alpha's howl turned into a squeal as his fur puffed and his whiskers crackled. He skidded across the polished floor, landed in a decorative fountain with a splash that sent court water everywhere, and emerged sputtering and indignant, hair standing on end like a static sculpture. The throne room erupted into laughter. Kalith, watching from the side, barked a laugh that was half pride and half exasperation. The alpha, humiliated but alive, slunk away with his dignity damp and his fur in need of serious grooming. Glenn bowed to the court, smirking and ridiculous, and Captain Mara clapped him on the shoulder. The old advisor, who had been watching from a safe distance, faintly scolded him for the mess. "Do try to keep the fountains clean," the advisor said, aghast. Glenn grinned. Noted. The day closed with a strange, warm exhaustion. The citadel had been tested and had held. Alliances had been reforged with laughter and blood and a single, consensual bite. Glenn stood between his queen and his mother and felt, for the first time since the Crimson Whisper's ice, that the future, terrible, political, and absurd, might be survivable after all.